Hello and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a new weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Go Thansen. At Frontier, we know how hard keeping track of events in Myanmar can be. And in this podcast, I'm joined by journalists and experts to discuss some of the most consequential, convoluted, or just plain interesting stories of the past week. It's Friday, November 1, 2024, and today on our very first episode, I'm joined by Ben Dunant, Editor-in-Chief at Frontier Myanmar. Hello, Ben.
Hello, great to be here. Thank you, Luke.
As well as Go Yi-moon, Senior Reporter with Frontier. Hello.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
And also Jason Tower, Country Director of the Burma Program at the United States Institute for Peace. Hello, Jason.
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me to be on.
Oh, thank you for joining. Now, this week, widespread conflict between resistance groups and the military continued across the country, with airstrikes and retaliatory attacks by soldiers on civilians. These included a gruesome massacre by the military in Dilin Township on Saturday, and airstrikes killing at least 16 people in Nauncho Township on Monday and Wednesday. Limited news also continues to trickle out about a military column and their ongoing plunder of villages in Budalin Township, where dozens of civilians are still being used as human shields and hundreds of homes have been torched in the last 3 weeks. We also learned that last week, Ni So Maung, the son-in-law of former military commander-in-chief Than Shwe and a critic of military rule, has been detained in Mandalay, and many of his close friends have since gone into hiding. And then on Saturday, film critic Shine Tet Aung was detained by the military after posting a negative review of a Burmese movie on Facebook, which may or may not be a coincidence. And as reported in Frontier's daily briefing newsletter on Monday, social media has been abuzz with controversy after Myanmar beauty pageant director Tu Ant Nguyen was accused of coercing Daewoo teenage beauty queen Thay Soon Yein to relinquish her second runner-up title in this year's Miss Grand International contest in Thailand. Tu Ant Nguyen was banned for life from the contest and was also threatened with a lawsuit for accusing the pageant's president of bribery. Netizens online debated whether the contest was corrupt, whether Tu Ant Nguyen was simply a sore loser, or whether Thay Soon Yein should have used her public platform in the same way that model Han Lee did at the same contest in March 2021, when she spoke out against the military's killing of protesters. That resulted in her having to flee Myanmar and seek asylum. But today, we're starting with the 1-year anniversary of Operation 1027, the consequential endeavour undertaken by the Three Brotherhood Alliance that has seen the military suffer huge defeats since it was launched last year on the 27th of October, including the losses of Laokain and Lashio towns, and for the very first time, the Myanmar military has lost the Northeast Regional Military Command headquarters. According to the recent October report by People's Goal, a military defections advocacy and support organisation, Operation 1027 has also directly led to at least 4,000 soldier surrenders. The Myanmar military has been pounding the areas that it lost across northern Shan State with airstrikes, and the 1027 anniversary last Sunday was no exception, with several civilians injured on that day alone. Now, the extent of the success of 1027 surprised analysts and emboldened resistance groups elsewhere in the country. But some of that operation's gains are now being imperiled by pressure from China, which is closing border crossings and lecturing resistance groups. Last Sunday, our guests Go Yi-moon and Ben Dunant used Frontier's bi-weekly Political Insider newsletter to question whether the Three Brotherhood Alliance member, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, colloquially known as the Kokang Army, can keep control of Lashio Town, the important trading hub close by to the Northeast Regional Military Command HQ. So Ben, to kick things off, let's start with the basics. Why do government authorities in China even care who controls Lashio?
Well, to start with, what we're seeing now with Chinese authorities really throwing their weight behind the military regime is something of a policy pivot. Beforehand, when Operation 1027 was first launched about a year ago, it appeared to give the green light to the operation by the Three Brotherhood alliance of ethnic armed groups, partly because it seemed to align with their frustration with the military regime's failure to crack down on cyber scam centers. And it seems that China was comfortable with this operation, presumably because they thought that groups like the MNDAA were only interested in more limited territorial gains. It seems that they did not expect these groups to go so far. And therefore, the full Evlasho to the MNDAA in August was a very big shock and seemed to cross a red line, because it seemed to pose suddenly an existential threat to the regime. The Myanmar military, which has been in charge of the country for most of the years since independence from the UK, has never lost a regional military command before. So when one of these commands starts to fall, that raises questions of how long the regime can actually survive. And that's not something that China appears willing to accept. The other problem that it would have perceived is that the seizure of Lasho would have potentially disrupted its longer-term plans to devise a trade and logistics corridor from the Bay of Bengal in Rakhine State all the way overland to Yunnan province. So for that reason, it seemingly began to feel that these ethnic armed groups near the border that it previously thought it had a reasonable amount of control over were suddenly out of control, that they needed to be tamed, and that really they didn't really see any alternative to dealing with the military regime as its national partner in Myanmar, even if it was also happy to have a direct relation with ethnic armed groups in areas close to its border.
Thank you, Ben. And so maybe we could move from here into how, and maybe more on the why, is China interfering with this wider Yunnan-Myanmar border area? And Jason, I think you spent a lot of time researching just this question.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. And I think that Ben's touched on a lot of the key points here already. But, I think some of the key things are, if you go back to 2023, one of the key things that China was really messaging to the Myanmar military was the growing concerns about the scam centers on the China-Myanmar border. This is something it was, of course, also mentioning and interacting with the United Wa State Army around, as well as to some extent with the National Democratic Alliance Army. But I think of significance really from May, when China first started to make this quite public in terms of its interactions with the military regime. You saw all the way up until September that the military largely pushed back. You saw that senior military officials, senior representatives of the SAC, they both denied that there was a problem. And in many cases, they said that China simply shouldn't worry about this, that it should instead focus on tourism, focus on economic development and the like. And you then saw in September that the Chinese side really, I think, escalated the situation. It sent a very strong signal to the Myanmar military of its desire to see a crackdown. What it did was it arrested 3 individuals from the Myanmar military's Kokong Border Guard Force elites who had been invited to participate in China in the border area in a cultural activity. And so I think that act, sent a very strong signal to the Myanmar military that there needed to be some action taken, specifically in Kokong. And then when that didn't happen, I think all along the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army was looking at this as an opportunity, looking at this as a way of ultimately advancing that battle to recover its territory in the Kokong region and to win the war to go home, as the Kokong would put it. And so you saw that was really how Operation 1027 Part 1 was framed, that this was an operation to eradicate the scams out of that area. And then, of course, this was also an operation to eradicate the Myanmar military dictatorship. Now, I think from China's vantage point, it saw a lot of value in part one of what the MMDAA was doing. And as Ben's already alluded to, you saw not only where China greenlit that, it actually took steps and actions that helped the MMDAA as they narrowed in on the territory of Rakhine. For example, you saw the Chinese side issue arrest warrants for the Myanmar military's border guard force at the exact moment. These are the border guard force elites and the key families in Kokong that the Myanmar military was relying on to defend that territory. Those arrest warrants, I think, sent a very strong signal of China's intention, which was more or less to support the MMDAA to achieve that objective. And that's precisely what happened. If you then fast forward, though, to January, China already has seen that the Myanmar military has been sent a very strong signal. The Myanmar military is now starting to be a little bit more collaborative, so it actually hands over the leaders of its border guard force, and those scam centers have been eradicated. From the vantage point of the Chinese, further movement forward on Operation 1027 doesn't really make a whole lot of sense anymore, unless China's ambition is also to, meet the MMDAA around the second part of what they announced back on the 27th of October of last year, which was eradicating military dictatorship. I don't see where China has any interest in doing that. You simply haven't seen China express any goals of that nature. So from January, China began to pivot to pushing these parties to do a deal. And of course, you had this Haiken agreement that was negotiated in January, which took effect on January 12th of this year. The Haiken agreement basically froze the conflict. It stopped the Myanmar military's airstrikes in exchange for the Brotherhood stopping further attacks on Myanmar military positions up in northern Shan state. That held for a few months. That held really up until about May. And throughout that next period, I think China was signaling to all of those parties, both to the Brotherhood and to the Myanmar military, that it wanted to see ceasefire capitalism. Basically, the parties should come together. They should come around with agreement to facilitate trade, and they should work with China around economic development. And that more or less the logic was, okay, develop your way out of this conflict. That was not really something, though, that I think the MMDAA wanted to do. The reality is that I think, as you've seen over the past couple of months, the MMDAA does have much bigger ambitions than just winning a war to go home. It sees that there are existential security threats coming from the Myanmar military, and it sees many benefits and advantages in building these broader alliances towards actually achieving that second element of the objectives of Operation 1027 from its vantage point. And so I think for that reason, you saw where these talks collapsed, because neither the Myanmar military nor the MMDAA really wanted to make significant concessions there. They both had, I think, from their vantage points, different things to gain by resuming hostilities. And that's precisely what happened. I think what probably caught the Chinese off guard is how quickly the MMDAA and the brothers were able to move on Lashu, and how quickly the Myanmar military's Northeastern Command has fallen. And that really, I think, has now triggered China to adopt a much more forceful strategy in trying to achieve its objectives of bringing about some form of a new normal or a soft landing in the northern part of the country. But what it's also done is, from the vantage point of the Chinese government, it's put the MMDAA on really the wrong side of the equation here. I would say up until the fall of Lashu and the resumption of Operation 1027 in Part 2, from the Chinese vantage point, in many respects, the MMDAA had the moral high ground. They had helped a lot with eradicating scam centers. They had helped give China some additional leverage to try to compel the Myanmar military to come to the table. But once the MMDAA starts moving on Lashu, and once they begin signaling that this is an operation actually to move on Mandalay, then this actually does seem to threaten the Myanmar military much more at an existential level. And it opens up the possibility that the resistance could even win here. So I think that that's why China has pivoted. It really maintains those objectives of trying to get these parties to come to some form of a deal so that it can pick up its real long-term strategic priorities in Myanmar, which is that geostrategic economic and trade corridor through Myanmar that connects China to the Indian Ocean.
Thank you, Jason, for that excellent detail. I want to ask you now, Go Yimon, you've been writing an upcoming feature which is about the pressure that China is bringing to bear and the border closures in northern Shan State. I wanted to ask you, how extensive have they become, and what are their effects on local people who are, just trying to trade as normally?
The first thing is that China doesn't allow to import rice and the agricultural products into the China. And second thing is China doesn't allow to export the electricity products and the such as solar panels and the batteries for the electric bike and the materials for the buildings. So that I can confirm. So China doesn't allow to carry that products into Myanmar, and then the Myanmar traders are worried about their export products. So now I think in November or December there is a watermelon season. So the traders are worried about if the China will be banned or not. So if China banned the watermelon and rice, so the farmers and the traders will be in trouble. So some people said the China doesn't allow to export the rice and the watermelon and the corn, but I cannot confirm yet. Yeah. So that another thing is the people in the border town. So especially in Liza, expensive to buy an egg, and also they have no petrols. So I think for the 1 liter petrol, they have to spend 50,000 jet. Yeah, it's too expensive. So I think in other border towns, the people will be faced like the same problems very soon. Yeah.
Thank you. And thinking about the people who are now living either under MNDAA rule in Lashio or with the difficulties of closed borders, do we think, is it possible that this will influence their political opinions? It might make them unhappy, for example. Will they associate the MNDAA's victory in Lashio and elsewhere with hardship? And would that maybe affect their support for the revolution or resistance against the military?
I just saw the news that now the MNDAA is looking for the informants from the military. So the MNDAA now announced that they have arrested 20 military informants because the MNDAA think those people are responsible for the military's daily airstrike. Yeah, I think in the people in Lashio, 50% of people doesn't like the MNDAA and another 50 doesn't like the military because they don't want to see their town, like the conflict areas, to become like a war zone or something. Yeah. But some people think, so if the military is not in Lashio, they think the MNDAA will not come. So 50-50, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Yimon. And Jason, I can see that there's something you'd like to add.
There is kind of this narrative that 80%, this is according again to MMDAA sources, but that 80% of the public opinion in Lashu stands with the MMDAA. Again, the MMDAA may have some bias around that, but there is such a number that has been circulated by some MMDAA-linked sources. But I would agree that, the MMDAA kind of getting more involved in trying to weed out potential individuals in the, kind of Lashu area and around Lashu and in other parts of their controlled territories is actually causing quite a lot of frustration. And then I think along with that, and this is probably the Myanmar military strategy, just simply these constant airstrikes that have already killed at least 7 people in the MMDAA controlled territories and injured at least 60 or more, that this is really a war of attrition. I mean, what the Myanmar military is trying to achieve here is to get people in those areas to start resisting the MMDAA simply because there's no possibility of resuming normal livelihoods. And so I think the response of the MMDAA to that has been to put a lot of resources into trying to roll out governance. And if you look at the public messaging and signaling, almost every day you see the MMDAA messaging one of 2 things. One is just how devastating the airstrikes are, which I think is an appeal to try to get other actors that might have influence to stop the airstrikes. And to feel more sympathy towards the cause of the MMDA and those in those territories. But then the second point of this is they're focusing on their approach to stabilizing markets, getting water running, providing education or health or immunizations. So you're seeing almost daily news posts coming from the MMDAA on their Telegram and on other MMDAA linked social media accounts that show them, providing those types of services to try to send that message to their public that they can provide, they can govern, and they can give the people goods that the Myanmar military never would have given them.
Great points there, Jason. And just before we move on to the next topic, let me quickly ask you, the listener, are you a Frontier Myanmar member? For as little as $8 a month, you can support independent journalism in Myanmar and gain access to regular exclusive content direct in your inbox, such as behind the scenes, daily briefing, media monitor, and political insider newsletters. Go to frontiermyanmar.net online and click membership. And with that little message, let's get back to it. Now some news from the United Nations. UN Special Envoy on Myanmar, Julie Bishop, told the General Assembly on Tuesday that she has been to Naypyidaw and met with Min Aung Hlaing and plans to go back. She also mentioned she had met with various others, including resistance organisations, civil society representatives, and people in the Rohingya diaspora. Her comments were underwhelming. Quote, Myanmar actors must move beyond the current zero-sum mentality. There can be little progress on addressing the needs of the people while armed conflict continues across the country. Some pundits have been hopeful that Bishop might do better than her predecessors based on her experience as foreign minister in the Australian government. And analysts have noted she needs to be subtle, persistent, and facilitative in the off chance that an inflection point in the political crisis comes along. Most likely, this would be the military being so weak that it requires an exit strategy. So, Jason or anyone, what do you think is the significance of Bishop's recent admissions? Is this just business as usual for yet another special envoy, or is there something you can read between the lines?
Just maybe to say, to start off here, I think one thing that is important is that she came in with a mandate to engage all stakeholders. And so I think perhaps part of that speech and that revelation was to send the message to the UN, to the member states that is moving forward, that she has in fact engaged with all of these different stakeholders. I think that the revelations around the meeting with the military, on one hand, they illustrate that there is a much higher level of caution being exerted than some of the previous envoys in terms of trying to prevent the Myanmar military from using such a meeting to gain legitimacy. There were no flashy pictures about it or anything of that nature. But I think it's likely that messaging is going to trigger frustration on part of some members of the resistance, members of the Myanmar population who are increasingly subject to the Myanmar military's atrocities, and that's I think one of the challenges, given the pressure that's coming from the UN for there to be that type of an engagement strategy. I guess when it comes to sort of the comments, I think that a lot have picked up on around zero sum mentality. I think again that's also something that's likely to trigger something of frustration or trigger a sense that those who are suffering on the ground as a result of these daily atrocities, airstrikes, other horrible sorts of things, that the Myanmar military is taking this very much zero sum approach. And I think one of the challenges that any envoy or anyone who is in a position to try to work on this issue faces is that it's very difficult to gain more leverage over the Myanmar military to compel it to shift gears, to compel it to try to start moving back. And that becomes even more problematic when you start to have countries coming in and providing very strong support to the Myanmar military, as you're seeing China do at the present moment. And I think there's no question at all that the recent increase in atrocities and airstrikes, it's most clear and present in northern Shan, but it relates very much to that shift in posture on the part of China.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And Ben, you look like you've got something to add.
I think what I would say is that the mandates of special envoys, whether they're the UN one or the ASEAN one, it's all built around mediation. And mediation only really works when a conflict is at a particular place. And I think the conflict in Myanmar is not at that place. It's not. So if in some future time the conflict were at a place where mediation were conceivable, then the special envoys could play an important role. However, we don't really seem to be really close to that now. And I think it's also worth remembering that this special envoy is not the first UN special envoy. The achievements of the previous special envoys were very, very limited. There was a long gap between the appointment of this special envoy and the previous one. And during that gap, there was some debate over whether the UN should really rethink its whole approach, that appointing a new envoy in the same way would represent a lack of imagination. So I think the fact that she was just appointed with the same mandate, I think did not lend a lot of confidence that the UN is really serious or willing to think creatively about what role it could play in the conflict.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that imagination is not the strongest suit of the UN. Now, let's shift our attention to Rakhine State and Bangladesh for the rest of the show. As we speak, the Arakan Army is continuing to besiege the Western Regional Military Command headquarters in An Township, having already gained control of the downtown and nearby hills, from where it can threaten the base with artillery. The AA's thrust for An Township is being supported by several other resistance groups in the areas, such as the Minbu District PDF, under National Unity Government Command. The Myanmar Army has managed to reinforce the base this week, but the trajectory is not looking good, and the Command HQ's leaders have already abandoned the base. So, Ko Yimon, is it inevitable that the Western Regional Military Command will fall to the Arakan Army?
Yes, also now the AA is almost control the whole area of An Township. So now everyone think the region command will be fallen soon. So so they have arrested. I heard they have arrested many the military soldiers, and so now only they need to only to control the region command. So now the AA soldiers are ready to enter the region command. Like the situation is So as soon as I think they will control very soon. Yeah, maybe tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And to Ben or Jason, what do you think the consequences would be for the AA taking control of this township, and how would the military or even China react to losing a second regional military command?
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, I think, of course, the Arakan army is interesting here. I think, unlike the Chinese pressure that you've seen very openly on the TNLA and the MMDAA, you've not seen the same sorts of pressures really targeted at the Arakan army. I think the AA, for its part, has been quite cautious, particularly when it comes to the Chinese investments in Rakhine State. And you've seen also historically that the ULA-AA has put out messaging, of its intent to provide security to those investments and to be a part of China's Belt and Road Initiative and of the different Chinese economic initiatives there. I think interestingly, also, you've seen where the Indian government has increasingly been engaging with the AA. You saw where earlier this year there was a visit from local Indian officials into AA territory to look at some of the Indian projects there. So, I think that does, in some sense, give the Arakan army quite a bit of space, I think, to hedge across the different actors that it is going to need to maintain relations with. Really, I think for all of these external stakeholders, they're becoming increasingly reliant on the Arakan army in Rakhine State in order to ensure the ongoing security of their projects. And for China, the stakes couldn't be higher. I mean, you're talking about infrastructure that represents the only source of piped oil and gas to the southwestern provinces of the country. Plus, you're talking about connectivity to the Indian Ocean, and really the main rationale for the billions, tens of billions, even over $100 billion in investments in the China-Myanmar borderlands and all of these cross-border zones that are now the host to a lot of manufacturing down in the China-Myanmar border area, predominantly on the China side of the border. So I think that China is using a bit more caution when it comes to the Arakan army. Of course, the collapse of Anne and the fall of another regional command, I think, is going to have some pretty profound implications. It's very likely to embolden resistance actors in other places. It's going to continue to send that signal that this is a military that's on its back foot. Despite, growing Chinese support, it's still deteriorating further in terms of its control in different parts of the country. And you're seeing that really in Kachin and in Rakhine, and in other places as well, I would argue. So, this is going to, I think, if that in fact does happen, and it looks increasingly likely, this is going to, I think, have a pretty strong impact, both in terms of the domestic situation and how the different revolutionary forces see the current situation. But it's also going to have some external impacts as well. And I think it's likely to give the Arakan army and maybe some of the other resistance actors a little bit more leverage, given, again, the importance regionally of some of those geostrategic investments that are there in Rakhine State.
And moving on from that take, usually this podcast will go for 30 minutes, but this week we have a special sneak insight into a members-only event. On Wednesday, Frontier held a panel event titled The Revolution Next Door: What Regime Change in Bangladesh Means for Myanmar. It was moderated by Andrew Nackimson and with guests Sheikh Sabiha Alam, a Dhaka-based journalist, and Thomas Keane, senior consultant for Myanmar and Bangladesh with International Crisis Group. So to round out the podcast today, we're going to release some short highlights of that private hour-long event. We'll start with Tom Keane responding with some analysis to a question about the relationships between Bangladesh's security forces, its new interim civilian government, and the handful of armed groups currently fighting in Rakhine State, against or alongside the Myanmar army. This was a Zoom event, so the audio is a bit compressed.
the Bangladesh security forces have relations with both sides, so the Arakan Army and Rohingya armed groups. And the focal point for managing relations with these groups is called DGFI, Army Intelligence, but there are other agencies involved as well. For a long time, DGFI actually had pretty good relations with the AA. The Arakan Army had bases in remote areas along the border, and this really helped the group shift from Kachin State to Rakhine around 10 years ago. And then in 2018-19, obviously, they really started their insurgency in Rakhine. But in that sort of formative period, having bases along the border was really important. And then at the same time, concurrently over the border in Bangladesh, ARSA, Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, had gained control of the refugee camps. But it was causing a lot of problems for Bangladesh. You may recall the assassination of Mohibullah, for example, in 2021, who was advocating for repatriation. The next year, in 2022, Rohingya Solidarity Organization, RSO, suddenly re-emerged. It had been dormant, really, for a few decades. And it then started taking on ARSA for control of the camps. And that's when we saw the insecurity and violence really increase in the refugee camps as part of that turf war between the two Rohingya armed groups. And there were a lot of allegations from Rohingya people that the Bangladesh security forces had actually revived RSO to get rid of ARSA from the camps. But when the fighting reached northern Rakhine earlier this year, the dynamics really changed. The Myanmar military, began recruiting Rohingya to fight against the Arakan army. And simultaneously, like almost exactly around the same time, the relationship between DGFI, Bangladesh security forces, and AA really started to go downhill. And the RSO and ARSA suddenly started cooperating with the Myanmar military fighting against the AA. So there's a really dramatic shift in the space of a few months. Now, in terms of the relationship between AA and Bangladesh, you can see from the AA perspective, I guess, if you think that Bangladesh security forces are supporting RSO, which is fighting against you, that's obviously going to strain relations. And it's fair to say that they haven't patched things up yet. I think it's clear now to us, right, that the Myanmar military is going to be forced out of Mongdor. They're holding on in the Border Guard Police Battalion. But the question is what comes next? And my big concern is that there'll be a Rohingya insurgency, which I think, Rohingya armed groups fighting against the Arakan army, which I think would be devastating for everyone, really. The AA would struggle to contain it and would face inevitably allegations of human rights violations. And Rohingya civilians will be forced to take a side. They're already being forced to take a side, but that would become even more pronounced. And many would probably just flee to Bangladesh. Bangladesh is already hosting around 1 million refugees. It doesn't really want any more Rohingya. And some will probably try to reach third countries like Malaysia or Thailand. So I think that the Rohingya insurgencies, are something that really concerns me for the months ahead. And one problem, I think, in this part of the country is that the aid really doesn't have much contact at all with the civilian side of the Bangladesh government. Sheikh Hasina had this long-standing policy of not engaging armed groups. So the engagement with the Arakan army got outsourced to the intelligence agencies. And that's fine when you're talking about a very small insurgent group, which the Arakan army was initially. But it's hardly feasible when the Arakan army controls almost the entire border and probably the entire border quite soon. The interim government, has a different view, and it recognizes the need to engage the Arakan army. And they've talked about that publicly. But I think there's a real question of whether Ahmed Yunus and his advisors can really take control of the issue. His government is to some extent, and Subir talked about this as well, it's a fragile government dependent on the army. And the army sees the border as its domain. So Yunus can't afford to step on their toes too much. But at the same time, there's clearly a need for a deeper, broader engagement between Bangladesh and the Arakan army than there is now. But it will be tricky for Yunus because of the civil military dynamics in Bangladesh.
And Tom mentioned there the potential for what he called a Rohingya insurgency in Arakan army-controlled Mongdor township, and a further prolonged or worsened refugee situation in Bangladesh, where hundreds of thousands of Rohingya live, displaced from the many pogroms and attacks on them over the years. During the panel, Sabiha gave sobering opinions about how these refugees are perceived by Bangladesh people today.
Our people are not happy with the shelters and with Rohingya people in our land. This is not the reaction from the local community only, but people in the city, people in other parts, people, educated people, they don't like the Rohingyas. It's the same we have been seeing anywhere in the country, the attitude towards the immigrants, like undocumented people. Like whenever there is a murder, whenever there is a theft, whenever there is a burglary, they would say that the Rohingyas are involved in that. So they are always pointing fingers at the Rohingyas, that they are winning our society and stuff. So I don't know if it's too strong a word, but I think people in that locality and some places in the country, they hate Rohingyas. They don't want to give them the refugee status because we haven't signed the treaty and we don't call them refugees officially. So if you go inside the Rohingya camps, they have beautiful schools. They are learning something to read and write in their language, but they won't be able to get a job once they will come out of those Rohingya camps. Like I am for integration because we have 7 million Bangladeshis across the world and many of them are undocumented. So I think we should be empathetic towards the Rohingyas. We should give them access to education and access to jobs. If we can't ensure education and jobs, they will be hired and they will be like they will join RSL or they will join ARSA. For this interim government, it's quite difficult to handle this issue in this moment because the government led by Professor Yunus, they are facing so much challenges right now. Like they don't know what to do right now. Rohingya issue, I don't think it's a priority in the list.
So, according to Sabiha, most people in Bangladesh have no patience left for the Rohingya people's suffering. And this is not a priority in the least for the new interim Bangladesh government. Meanwhile, I should note that hundreds of Rohingya refugees in at least 2 boats have landed in Sumatra, Indonesia in just the past 10 days, continuing what has been years of this community taking risky, desperate journeys in search of better lives. We're going to end the podcast with that bonus content and thank our guests today. To you, Go Yimon, Jizumyaji Dimarekmya.
Thank you.
To Ben, thank you.
Thank you very much for hosting, Luke.
And to Jason, a special thanks for being our first external guest on the show.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on. Goodbye.
Now, we would normally go through the correspondence. However, this is our first episode and we don't have any correspondence. So please send us emails. You can reach us with the email address podcast@whimyanmar.com. Now, the situation continues to develop, including the Arakan Army's siege of the Arn Regional Military Command. So join us again next week for what's happening in Myanmar. Senior General Min Aung Hlaing is likely to attend the Greater Mekong Summit in Kunming this coming week, the first time he's been invited to China since the 2021 coup, and will likely be picking apart his comments. Until next week, farewell and take care.